Good evening, friends. This is Richard Wolff. Thank you very much for joining me today. These are indeed tumultuous times, and we are all doing our best to cope with what is being called the new normal. We've just been through an extraordinary election here in the United States, and I'm going to be talking about that. But before we jump in, I want to make a couple of announcements. This presentation, which we offer every other month, is called Global Capitalism Live Economic Update. It's brought to you by Democracy at Work and is co-sponsored by the Left Forum and the Judson Memorial Church on Washington Square in New York City. These presentations are fundraising events for Democracy at Work. We urge those of you watching and listening, especially if you have never donated before, to please consider supporting this project. Indeed, your support is what has made this series of presentations possible. You can become a monthly donor on Patreon, or you can make a one-time donation on our website. Direct links to both of those options can be found in the video description below. Please be sure to like this video below and click the red subscribe button. Thank you for your support, and we hope you all stay safe and healthy in times that do not make that easy. We waited this month until the third Wednesday, even though our normal schedule is every other Wednesday. And we did that because when we planned this program, we anticipated the election might be contested here in the United States, and indeed it was, indeed it is. And that is part of the kind of government we have had over the last 4 years, which is now clearly over. And I will be talking about that election and its meanings and implications this evening as a major part of what we want the evening to discuss. Another difference is that it won't just be me this evening. I requested 6 people, some of whom, perhaps all of whom, you may know, or you may have seen or heard in the past. I've asked them to join me tonight to make, which they've done in recent days, short 4 or 5 minute videos, and you're going to see them this evening interspersed with my own presentation. So it will be, you might say, roughly half me and half people like Laura Flanders, Nomi Prins, Lee Camp, Yanis Varoufakis, Lee Carter, and Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. All of these people have much to say, have different approaches, different priorities, and I believe their comments, together with my own, will make an interesting evening, an interesting set of ideas about where we are in the world today, with special emphasis on the United States because of the election, and that it will altogether be a worthwhile enterprise. So let me begin. Here in the United States, the election that we have just completed cost many, many billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars. In our country, here, the United States, 2 political parties have a completely stranglehold monopoly on politics, at least of the parliamentary electoral kind. The billions that they spent, each of them, to run for office, and we're talking many billions of dollars, this they both agree is a perfectly reasonable approach. They have had many opportunities to change the law, to limit the amount of money that can be spent, to limit the amount of time that the campaigns cover at great cost. And they have chosen not to stop it, not to end it, not to put limits. And so the money goes more and more. Each time our election is the costliest we have ever had. And so the many billions of dollars spent on the election, which both parties agreed to, happened at the same time that the two parties could not agree on a national strategy to cope with the COVID-19 crisis, which is why, one major reason why, that crisis is more devastating in the United States than perhaps any other country on the planet. They also couldn't spend those billions on a stimulus economic program here in the United States to do something about the tens of millions of people that are unemployed, underemployed, or underpaid. A catastrophic economic crisis for which these billions could not have been spent because the two parties couldn't agree in the months leading up to the election. It's an extraordinary testament to the reality in this culture here in the United States that the two political parties that operate together, and let me underscore together, the economic and political monopoly over our politics, it is interesting that both of these parties are 98% pro-capitalist. The two parties fall all over each other in supporting, celebrating, subsidizing capitalism. Why do I say 98%? Well, because 2%, it's a number I picked out of the hat, it's a very small number, 2% represent the socialists, those who are critical of capitalism, who say something inside the Democratic Party about some issues when they are not marginalized, silenced, or excluded, which happens to most of them most of the time. So in our monopolized politics, we do not have in the United States freedom of choice, the way other countries do. We pride ourselves in the United States on having freedom of choice. And in some areas, we do. If you go into a supermarket and you want to buy breakfast cereal, you have many different kinds, many different brands to choose from. If you go into an automobile dealership, you have different brands and different models to choose from. We want choice. We want the freedom to choose. Except in our politics, that minor area of life, where we only need two. And we need two that on the great question of capitalism, the system we live with, there is no choice because choosing between one or the other lets you choose between one pro-capitalist political party and another pro-capitalist political party. They don't disagree on capitalism. They disagree on how best to support, subsidize, and build capitalism. When you choose between them, you're choosing between who will support capitalism. If you want to choose against the support of capitalism, you have no real political contender to vote for. The two parties have arranged things so you have no freedom of choice. It's charming because they preach the freedom of choice, but they don't practice the freedom of choice. And for those of you who care, it's even worse. The system in Europe, for example, is called proportional representation. It's a simple idea. It goes like this. if 20% of the people want a socialist party enough to vote for it, then 20% of the people sitting in parliament writing the laws should be representatives of that party. The 20% want their voice heard when it comes to writing the law. They do not allow somebody who gets 51% of the vote to have all the seats in parliament for whatever area they represent. In other words, in the United States, it's a winner-take-all, no proportional representation. If you don't win, you lose completely. If half or just below half the people voted for you, they have no representative writing the law. It's a bizarre way to minimize, to exclude, to marginalize new emerging political movements. It's what monopolists do. In economics, we call what monopolists do the erection of barriers to entry, making it impossible for new, proudly innovative companies to get off the ground because they can't afford the advertising that the monopolists do, or they haven't had the laws written for them the way the monopolists did, or they don't have the money to get the attention of the politician the way the monopolists did. You know, barriers to entering a business or an industry. Our political monopolists have created barriers to anybody who's critical of capitalism. So you can't find it. You can even find many Americans who can't imagine it. And so we have a system that reflects the monopolization of politics by two pro-capitalist parties who hand each other the government every few years in a ritual of political make-believe. And so we have deepening inequality. And so we had a system unprepared for a virus. And we had a system incapable of containing the virus. And a system that wasn't prepared for the latest capitalist business cycle crash. And that is now incapable of containing the social disaster that crash produces. We have all the costs of a dysfunctional, monopolized political system, but all with the polite agreement of the two monopolists never to discuss the monopoly they operate, but to pretend instead that they are fierce competitors, insisting that we all join with them in pretending that the competition between them is anything other than the collusion to squeeze out everybody else. Don't be fooled. This is a good moment for me to introduce the first of my guests this evening. Her name is Laura Flanders. She's an independent journalist who runs and produces a very interesting, long-standing television and radio show of important commentary, both on what is going on politically and what ought to be going on or is emerging or is beginning to change the political outline of the countryside. It is a pleasure for me to invite Laura to speak with us for a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Laura Flanders of The Laura Flanders Show. You can watch every week at YouTube or at lauraflanders.org or subscribe to the free podcast. I'm recording this message for Rick and your friends, surrounded by trees and dead leaves, because with respect to election 2020, I don't think we're out of the woods yet. We are in a dangerous moment. that moment when the lens of our media narrative narrows. And having been, for a few glorious moments, on masses of people in action, registering to vote, getting out to vote, voting, the lens narrows to just a couple of people in Washington, D.C. And yes, we've got some history being made in our Vice President, Kamala Harris. Our Vice President-elect and our President-elect are going to be new faces with any luck in Washington. But there's an awful lot about them that reminds us of the past. Joe Biden especially takes us back to that moment in 2008 when we had a financial crisis on our hands, a mortgage disaster, a houseless, homeless crisis looming, and an administration came into power that demobilized the masses, demobilized the activists who had helped to bring them to D.C. We're in a moment just like that again. And if you were around and paying attention in 12 years ago, you'll remember that the so-called relief package that the Obama-Biden administration brought in was nowhere near enough for the people's need. Now, Joe Biden needed we the people to get elected. We the people have needs that are urgent today, whether you're talking climate change or recession or racism or the pandemic. The people's needs are worse today than they were 12 years ago. So while we are going to need to be active in Washington and all around this country at the level of government, and we're going to have to be active in our movements at the level of keeping those fascist forces at bay, we, I think, particularly we that watches my show and that watches this show and that listens to our podcasts, the we that talks about economic alternatives has got to get really serious. We are not the same as we were 12 years ago. Biden may be the same guy, but we have lived for more than a decade. And coming out of 2008, I think many of us said, you got a point. We can't just be anti-capitalist. We have to be for something else. Well, we have spent 12 years laying out alternatives and saying that another world is possible. I think our agenda, this particular our agenda now is to give people the confidence that those alternatives can actually change their lives. So I think the message that I would like to send today is that what we're going to be doing on the Laura Flanders Show is following alternatives as they play out, talking about the obstacles that exist to really organizing the workplace and education and housing and healthcare differently. There are some extraordinary initiatives in the works, but can they get to scale? What stands in their way? Because I believe the experience of making a democratic society, not waiting for someone else to do it, but of making one right now, where we live, where we are, in woods like these, that experience can help us build our movement power for the next time, whether that's 2 years or 4 years or 8 years from today. One of the things that we've been reporting on is the comparative success of worker-owned co-ops in this COVID economy, in this pandemic poverty. Worker-owned co-ops have, unlike most small businesses, come out fairly well. There have been fewer layoffs, more expansion, even new hirings at the businesses where the workers themselves could decide, sometimes on a dime, how to change their MO. We've seen people decide that they would take pay cuts to keep everybody employed. Check out the report from the U.S. Federation of Worker-Owned Cooperatives. That kind of experience of how an alternative works differently can change people. And I think that's what we have to build today. What happened in this last election? People got terrified and voted against Trump. People decided to hold their nose and vote for the old guy Biden. People got excited about the history-breaking nomination of Kamala Harris as as Biden's vice presidential candidate. And then a whole lot of other people did what they always do, which is organize no matter who, get busy doing no matter what, just to keep reactionary forces at bay and win some breathing room. We won some breathing room. Now we have to build in that breathing room so that people can not just see alternatives as ideas, but experience them, lived, and live the experience of making their lives different from the bottom up. Do we need federal help? Absolutely. Are we going to wait for that? We can't afford to. Whether it's giving one another care, defunding our police and finding alternative ways to keep our communities safe, addressing the recession, especially the she-cession that is affecting women and women of color most, or becoming sanctuary communities. We have to start that work where we are, and don't let anyone tell you that it's all and only now about what happens in Washington, D.C. For the Laura Flanders Show, I'm Laura Flanders. Check us out at lauraflanders.org. Podcast, TV show. We're probably on a public television station near you. I'm a big subscriber and regular listener to Economic Update. Thank you, Rick, for all you do.
Thank you, Laura. Let me introduce next an old friend, Nomi Prins, a former banker at Goldman Sachs, who has changed her direction and applied her wonderful research and analytical capabilities to really telling us how the banking system works in the world. She writes, she's an author. Let me welcome Nomi Prins with her thoughts on this election and what it means.
The world, and slightly more than half of the United States, did breathe a collective sigh of relief last Saturday as the United States election was finally called for the Biden-Harris ticket. And though President Trump can mount any number of legal battles, they're not going to change the math. But it's also important to note that around 70 million people voted for Trump, and it would be dangerous to just discount that proportion of the population, their concerns, or even their positions. In terms of the rest of the lay of the land on the Hill, the runoff in Georgia would have to be a sweep in favor of the Democratic Party in order for the Democrats to even make the Senate even. But from a practical standpoint, even if there are tie vote situations where, say, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris would be casting that deciding vote, the reality is that Biden would need bipartisan support in case he loses a Democrat or two in any vote in order to get any major legislation passed. And that means the sort of legislation that he will be able to propose and get passed cannot be perceived to be rocking too many political boats. Also, since the House lost 7 Democratic seats, though it did retain the more progressive seats, it means that Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, will have less of a margin there. And that's going to be both with respect to the Republicans and between the more centrist and the more progressive arms of the Democratic Party. And what all that means is that passing legislation will just not be a walk in the park for anyone. And the Biden-Harris administration is going to have to pick its battles, which probably will therefore require them staying very much in the center of the road. Now, there's also a very strong likelihood that from a financial economic perspective, that say the Biden White House and a Republican or even a split Senate could reach compromises on a larger pandemic-related stimulus package, and that could also include extra vaccine-related funding and possibly, and hopefully actually, any infrastructure plan or package, which is something that Trump promised again and again during the 2016 election, but absolutely never delivered. And in fact, he thwarted the possibility of that by imposing various supply chain tariffs and trade wars along the way. This could also translate into continuing, though, to keep taxes lower for corporations, which is something that the Biden campaign platform said it would raise, although they never said that they would raise those taxes back to what they were before Trump anyway. So any ground that's gained on fiscal stimulus will, of course, be so positive for all of those Americans around the country that are struggling with the loss of jobs or money or loved ones due to this pandemic. And in that respect, it would also be positive for the general economy and for regaining global status and respect and adopting some sort of a stronger leadership position with respect to the virus, to mask wearing, and any other protocols that are necessary in fighting this pandemic. But all of that combined is the reason that global stock markets relief rallied since the election. The thing is, neither Wall Street nor the financial markets nor bankers particularly like uncertainty. But having the election out of the way, and with it the threat of random trade wars and tweets, coming on top of the ongoing no-limit monetary policy or the central bank support that's led by the Federal Reserve and copied around the world by every other central bank, is also why we're likely to see an ever-widening disconnect between the financial markets and the real economy, or what I have coined a permanent distortion. Now, there will be items that will be done by executive order in the meantime. Biden will re-sign the Paris Climate Accord. He will rejoin the World Health Organization. And he will have a national coronavirus plan, which we deeply have needed. I also think that he's going to push investment in green energy platforms and in projects. And that's not even just because of climate change and science, but it's also out of sheer economic and environmental necessity. That would help companies in the sustainable energy and infrastructure space create more jobs. That's also a reason that Wall Street has been putting its money behind that policy in all sorts of green and ESG types of funds and private equity companies and so forth. So nothing will fundamentally change, though, for Wall Street or the Fed or other central banks. The markets are going to continue their disconnect from the real economy as we move on to 2021, perhaps even more so than they did under Trump because of the removal of that tweet uncertainty element. The economic uncertainty and disparity that drove many of those suburban voters that even voted for the Biden-Harris ticket to the suburbs to begin with, because they are cheaper, that's a phenomenon that's going to grow. And that's because of where we are right now in terms of the state of the economy. It's because of the pandemic. It's because of the associated work from home patterns and the general economic fragility amongst all of our citizens. Plus, let's not forget, Biden was heavily favored by Wall Street. In fact, Wall Street provided him more in campaign donations this election than for both of Obama's elections combined, and absolutely more than it gave to Trump's re-election bid. That's because, again, Wall Street values democratic centrist certainty over Trump capriciousness. So it's unlikely a Biden-Harris White House would do much to decrease Wall Street influence or increase regulations on Wall Street, or therefore to cut into permanent distortion overall, absent more grassroots pushing. There's still an opportunity to reduce the gap between the markets and the real economy. It's just that numerically, it's not something that's an obvious outcome from this election. I'm Nomi Prins, and that's my take.
Thank you, Nomi. And for the third in a row, before I make a few comments myself again, let me introduce Lee Camp. Many call him a comedian, which indeed he is. But he's also a very astute commentator on the passing political scene here in the United States, but also beyond. So it is a pleasure, with a smile and a twinkle, as well as an appreciation, for me to introduce to you Lee Camp.
Hello, I'm Lee Camp, host of Redacted Tonight. So, the election is finally over, but that doesn't mean the mainstream corporate media is actually talking about the things they should be talking about, by design. And that's because they only cover surface-level analysis. You see, there's 3 or 4 levels of reality that we should be discussing when we talk about this election or any American election. And by discussing, I mean screaming about. And by screaming about, I mean freaking the out. So let's freak out, shall we? Can we freak out together? Quick tangent, I actually got made fun of a lot as a kid for freaking out or spazzing out, as they called it. But when you think about it, when you really look around at reality, shouldn't we all be freaking out? I mean, so few people are enjoying their lives, so many people are struggling or oppressed, and there's new bizarre illnesses and viruses to worry about, and all of our so-called leaders are goddamn corrupt morons. And then you've got like a wedgie that's riding up your crack, and you can't grab it because you got your hands full. You got a drink in one hand, you got a video game remote or a baby or something in the other. So the wedgie just gets worse and worse and worse until it all comes crashing down. Point being, shouldn't we be spazzing out? If you look at reality, it's all spaz-worthy. I think everyone can agree on that. Anyway, we have 3 or 4 levels of reality that we should be talking about all of the time because they're incredibly important. But most of the time, average people and our media don't talk about all the layers. In fact, they only talk about the surface layer because our media is corporate tools. That's what they are. That's why they're there. So using this past election, using this election that we just saw as an example, layer 1 was who's going to win, Biden or Trump. That's the surface layer, right? It was fair to talk about that. I'm not saying don't talk about it. Fair to have a debate about it. But if you leave it at that and never dig deeper, you don't know what you're talking about. It would be like licking the top crust of an apple pie and saying, all right, I get it. It tastes like crust. But that's not all there is. You gotta dig down, idiot. Now let's get to layer 2, which is already a layer beyond what your mainstream corporate media will ever talk about. They only ever allow discussion on layer 1. Layer 2 is slightly deeper. It's that the oligarchy in America wins every election, no matter what. They win it in multiple ways. One is by making sure progressives and socialists and libertarians, etc., are purged from the process. The other is by money. And the third, perhaps most important way, is that our system simply does not pass anything through our government that isn't beneficial to the business community, aka corporate America. A large Princeton study found, I like to talk about it a lot, it studied 1,779 policy initiatives, policy topics, and it found that the American public has zero impact on what gets passed. What we want doesn't matter. They tell you it does, they act like they care, but nothing you and I want ever gets done unless it aligns with corporate interests. It's like being in an emotionally and mentally abusive relationship. They gaslight us. They tell us that we matter. They tell us they love us. They tell us they'll change, and they never do. They're just sitting there. They're just sitting there not changing, sitting there in their pajamas eating ice cream out of the box with their feet on the coffee table, putting coconut sprinkles in there into the ice cream, into the box when you don't like coconut sprinkles because they're tasteless in ice cream. And 2 days later, you find 3 in your mouth, and it tastes like hair or scabs or something. You know, I can get ready for a coconut sprinkle if I know it's coming, but if it's a surprise, you think you have scabs in your ice cream. They know that, and they don't care. They don't care. But that's my life. Point being, at the end of the day, we, the people, get nothing done in our government unless it aligns with business interests. Look at Obamacare, for example. America wanted healthcare, but in order to get it passed, the ruling elite made sure it was a giant giveaway to the health insurance industry. Wow, sounds like layer 2 is kind of important. But nope, let's never mention it in the mainstream media. Let's pretend it's never happening. Layer 3, we should really be talking about capitalism and environmental collapse. Under our economic system, the most powerful people, the corporatocracy, will eventually own everything, no matter what. The gravity in capitalism will always be towards corporate hegemony, every time, in every way. You can sometimes score roadblocks that slow them down, but that's all it does. Slow them down. As they take control, the environment, as in the natural world, will suck. I learned that word from reading medical textbooks. Sucks. Take, for example, Monsanto Roundup herbicide. We know it's causing cancer, it's killing people, but more importantly, it's killing the bees and the insects. And unfortunately, the natural world needs those little right? You can't exist without it. You might love that there aren't any gnats left, but nature is screwed. And as all the bees disappear and the insects disappear, we eventually will disappear. Maybe not this week, but it won't be long. Point being, how could this happen? How could we why hasn't Monsanto been stopped at any point? Well, they're too freaking powerful. They own the market. They own the officials. They own the regulators. They even own the science. How can a squad buy up the science? I don't know, but they did it. So that's what talking about level 3 looks like. It's talking about the economic system, the global impact. And yet again, the corporate media will never get to that discussion. Level 3 is more off limits for a cable news anchor than for the female anchors to not shave their pits. And yes, I know that's a standard old school gender role, but I'm just saying, point is, the odds of seeing that on one of those reporters is not common. It's as screwed up. It's as common as them digging into our capitalist system. That's all I meant by it. I'm totally down. If you want to have a giant Krusty the Clown hair under your pits, I'm totally cool with it. Level 4. Now we really get deep. This is the true analysis of our reality. And there are a lot of different topics on level 4. There's things like, what is money? Really? What is it? Is it anything? Where does it come from? What does it really mean? Or here's another one. What the hell are nation states? Why is everything have to be put in a box of national interests? What does it matter if I was born on this side of the line or that side of this line who even drew these dumb lines hundreds of years ago? Or it could be something like, why do we live the way we do in houses? Why do we live in such seclusion boxes, hardly interacting with our fellow humans, except at our wage slavery jobs where we go, hey, Jim, it's hump day. Ha, 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 ha. That's level 4. What the hell is that for existence? That's getting pretty deep into the philosophical realm. But how is it our media don't think that's important, ever? They don't think it makes sense to occasionally discuss level 4 of our reality, really dig down, figure it out, ask the questions, right? I'm not saying it has to be the beginning of every newscast. Hello, nation, it's 6 p.m. and remember, you're a victim of wage slavery, forced to live in a seclusion box. I'm not saying that. But can't the deepest echelons of our reality ever come up in the mainstream narrative? Or we just have to go buy some hidden book down in a basement somewhere, a bookstore run by a guy with food stuck in his curly mustache and one glass eye? Is that the only place we can learn about this stuff? Point being, those are the 4 layers of our reality. There are more layers, such as the fact that we're all energy waves and crazy shit like that, but we'll just stop at 4 for now. There are 4 crucial levels of our reality. And your media, your teachers, your leaders, most of your information sources never, and I mean never, get past level 1. That's like going to school and they just never teach you anything beyond how to color inside the lines with your crayons. That's it. Through all of high school, middle school, it's just color inside a line. That'd be the entire education. We are left at level 1 because it serves as a beautiful distraction. Never talk about the economic system. Never talk about how nations are used to divide us. Never talk about how corporations own our society. You just discuss level 1. Who will win the presidential election? Who will win the race for governor? Etc., blah, 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 bull. Dig deeper. If you don't do it for your own curiosity, do it because they don't want you to.
Thank you, Lee. Folks, I'd like to turn to another dimension of our election that has been particularly in evidence in the final months before the vote and in the days since the vote. The phrase, saving our democracy, have been articulated over and over again. Interestingly, they've been articulated by both sides in the monopolized political race, by the Trump Republicans and by the Biden Democrats. Each one wraps himself or herself in the mantle of the savior of democracy. The fact that people so otherwise opposed can both use that phrase, although I admit it's more often heard from the Democrats than the Republicans, but nonetheless, each side believes it represents the majority, it represents the real America. In fact, many on the Republican side believe that the democracy is what they turn to as the guarantor that they in fact won the election. In contrast, Biden, Harris, and the Democrats, who use the phrase more often, saving democracy, like to picture Mr. Trump and the Republicans as riding roughshod over democracy, ignoring democracy, doing it now by not conceding the electoral defeat, but doing it earlier by using governmental power rather than getting the mass of people to choose in a democratic way whatever direction is to be taken. So I found it interesting that the saving of democracy, or more particularly the saving of our democracy, was so often on the lips. Okay, I want to comment on the use of the phrase democracy or our democracy, having just gone through this election. Well, in a way, I have already commented on it. It's not a democracy if two political parties monopolize political discourse. It's not democracy if a presidential candidate's debate excludes all but the representatives of those two parties. It's not democracy if you allow an extremely unequal economic system like ours to pour virtually limitless amounts of money into the electoral process, because any notion of a democratic decision-making is undermined when some people have the kinds of resources to spend literally billions of dollars, as we know was spent, promoting one or another candidate. And of course, the billions that were spent promoted Republicans and Democrats. The tiny other parties in this country, kept tiny in and by this system, could not, of course, raise anything like these amounts of money, which is part of why they are so small that perhaps many of you don't even know that they exist or that they contested the election. But you know, the absurdity of calling this system democratic runs deeper than our political system. Let me explain. Let's turn to the economy. Let's turn to whether democracy is a concept that applies to the economy of the United States. And let me be clear on what definition of democracy I'm working with here, so there's no misunderstanding. By democracy, I mean a system which works according to the following basic rule. If you are affected by a decision, you therefore have the right to participate in that decision. You cannot be excluded from that decision, and therefore you don't have a democracy if there is a systematic, structurally enshrined exclusion of many people directly affected by a decision from any role in it. So I'm going to give you just two examples of how the economic system of the United States is not only not democratic, but is actively anti-democratic. Let me start with the market, perhaps the most celebrated institution in the American economy, and indeed in many around the world. An institution variously celebrated for being mankind's highest achievement, for being a paragon of efficiency, and so on. Here's a quality of the market you might want to think about. Let's suppose something in a market becomes scarce, and that all that I mean by scarce is that there are more people who want something, who demand it, than there are supplies of that something to meet that demand. We have excess demand. Demand is greater than supply. Okay, now some distribution has to take place whenever and wherever that happens in a market. And the way the distribution works in a market is that the demanders become aware that the demand exceeds the supply, because that information is supposed to be available and readily available in a market, especially one that functions the way markets are supposed to. So now the demanders know, and the suppliers do, that the demand is greater than the supply. What happens? Well, in a market, the suppliers begin to raise the price because they know they can, because there are so many more people who want it that what they'll get is the purchase, even at the higher price, of those who can afford it. Meanwhile, the demanders understand the same thing. They know that there are more of them than there is available supply. So what those who are rich will do is bid up the price of the scarce items. That will force the poor to drop out, to stop demanding it, because they can't pay the rising price. And in the end, you will distribute the scarce supply to those who will pay the highest price for it. In short, a market distributes to the richest buyers when there's an excess of demand. What would be the democratic way to handle this? Simple. All those affected by this situation, that is, the people who demand more than there is, all of those people could together make a decision. One person, one vote. Namely, how do you handle scarcity? Who should get the scarce items and who should not? That's the real issue here. And that could be decided democratically. So, for example, if the scarce item were milk and the rich people wanted to buy it for their pets and the poor people wanted to buy it for their children, you might have a democratic decision to give it to the people who are using it to feed their children. You might. Markets are not a democratic institution, are they? Here's another example. How is a capitalist enterprise organized? Well, here's the answer. A tiny group of people sitting at the top of a capitalist organization, and you know who they are, the owner of the business, perhaps the one who started it, or the one who inherited it, or the one who stole it, or the one who bought it. The owner sits at the top. If it's a corporate form of business, it's a group of major shareholders, those who own the bulk of the common shares issued by the company. And they in turn elect, these major shareholders, a board of directors that sits at the top of a corporation. Board of directors, usually 15, 20 people. Employees, dozens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, or with Amazon and a few others, millions of workers, of employees. All the power sits in the hands of the top, a tiny minority of those involved in the enterprise. They make all the key decisions: what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that all of the employees helped to produce. the decision, the disposition of all of those profits, all of that's done by a tiny, unaccountable minority. There's nothing democratic about it. Could there be democratic decision-making inside enterprises? You bet. It has a name. It exists. Worker co-ops. One person, one vote. Everybody involved in an enterprise. One person, one vote. And we decide, democratic majority rule, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the output, the revenue, the profits. Sure, you could have a democratic enterprise, but in capitalism, you don't. So then what in the world is the meaning of saving our democracy? It is very hard to save what you do not have. But that honesty, that self-awareness is not allowed into public discourse. No, not in the United States, where we have everyone pretending they're a democracy. Trump uses it. The Republicans use it. Biden uses it. The Democrats use it. Everybody is saving democracy. The only problem is it isn't there. Let me introduce you to my next friend and guest for this evening, someone who practices real democracy around the world. He is the former finance minister of Greece. He's an economist and an author. It is a pleasure to introduce you to Yanis Varoufakis.
I'm Yanis Varoufakis with a quick message to friends, comrades, colleagues to the United States and beyond regarding, what else? The general election, the presidential election in America. How do I see the prospect of a very thin, marginal victory by Joe Biden as the worst possible outcome? And let me explain that. I'm deeply happy that Trump is not going to be in the White House. But on the one hand, we have a resurgence, not a diminution, of Trumpism and of the old right and of the neo-proto-fascist, racist, Republican right wing. They feel strengthened by the outcome. They got millions more votes. And also this sense that they have, which is of course completely false, but nevertheless it is shared amongst them, of having been robbed of the White House by the liberal establishment. This augurs ill for all of us because of the radicalization of this movement that combines racism and a complete embracing of everything which is misanthropic, xenophobic, and particularly regressive. Now let's look at our side of politics, progressive politics. The one good thing, the silver lining for us supporters of Bernie Sanders, after Sanders was yet again impeded by the establishment within the Democratic Party from becoming a genuine opposition to Donald Trump, from winning the nomination of the Democratic Party. The silver lining was that at least there was some collaboration between the Sanders team and the Biden team that produced a Green New Deal of sorts. Not what I would have liked, but an interesting, nevertheless, economic policy to be implemented if Biden and Harris won the presidency and also the Senate. The fact that Biden is not going to control the Senate, and the fact that he has not had this landslide that he was banking on, means that now a president that was originally unwilling to implement a genuinely progressive Green New Deal now has been liberated from the obligation to do so as a result of not controlling the Senate. So, in contrast to the Trumpist right, which is going to be united, radicalized, and also strengthened and reinforced by the fact that they are going to be in opposition, Not to mention the fact that the next 2 years are going to see a Great Depression descending upon the United States, which is going to energize their opposition. In contrast to that, think of our side. We will have spent the last few months arguing amongst our own progressives that always saw Biden, quite correctly, as the representative of big business, that nevertheless they should hold their nose and vote for Biden because of the Green New Deal. And now there will be no Green New Deal. We will have, in other words, have helped put in the White House a president who is acting simply on behalf of big business, if he's acting at all, given the paralysis of the administration in view of the fact that it's not controlling the Senate. Had Trump won the White House, I would have been mourning, of course, but at least Democrats would be facing 2 or 4 years of radicalization, of rethinking and reorganizing. But now, the next 2 years will be a period during which only the Trumpists are going to be organizing, while we, progressives, are going to have to be defending a president who does not want to be in the same camp as us against big business. As for the rest of the world, I very much fear the neocons that sided with Biden and who will be returning to the Pentagon and the State Department. I hope those fears are proven false. I'm pleased that the Bolsonaros, Modis, Le Pen, Salvinis and the rest of the nationalist, xenophobic Internationale are going to lose their great supporter in the White House. But at the same time, we have, let us not forget, the radical center back in control of the White House and the Pentagon, and they have a very sorry record of interventions, of military adventures. I hope that they do not jeopardize the only good thing that Trump did on the international stage, which is effectively not to start a new war. With greetings from Greece and the sincere hope that Joe Biden is going to prove me wrong, this is Yanis Varoufakis on behalf of DN25. Carpe diem. Let's continue the struggle. We have a lot to do.
Thank you, Yanis. I would like to turn now to say something else that is too often unsaid, for which the words are thought to be too daring, too premature, not yet ready, and so on. But I would like to move the conversation forward, so I'm going to talk about it. What the United States lacks and needs is a new political party. It needs to break the stultifying dilemma of two monopolistic parties, to stop this process in which the allowable discourse in the society is limited to what the right will tolerate and what the left will tolerate, when right and left are limited by the Republican and Democratic parties. Let's take a look at what some of the costs of not challenging their monopoly mean for us right here, right now. The United States is a disaster when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis. Before COVID came, we knew as a society that there are dangerous viruses. In 1918, the United States suffered a devastating virus, one that started in a military base in Kansas, right in the middle of the United States. It killed nearly 700,000 people, 3 times what we have already suffered now with COVID-19. We know what viruses can do. We learned again with SARS, with Ebola, with MERS. We know. History has taught us, and recent past history has taught us again. We knew it would be possible. Likewise, we know that capitalism as an economic system is stunningly unstable. Wherever capitalism has settled over the 300 to 400 years it has been the emerging and then dominant economic system in the world, every 4 to 7 years on average, it has an economic downturn. You know, a crash, a recession, a depression, a bust, a crisis. We have many words for something that is so prevalent in our environment. So we know what the story is. And we have no reason not to be ready for, aware of, the crises that capitalism imposes on us every 4 to 7 years on average. Millions lose their jobs. Businesses go bankrupt. Cities, towns, whole countries have their budgets disappear because unemployed people can't pay taxes. And so the revenues needed to provide public services dry up. And in this capitalist system, just as the private sector goes into a crisis by dragging down the revenues of the public sector, you have fewer public services exactly when you need more to compensate for the failure of the private sector. If that isn't a dysfunctional system, what is? We've had 3 crashes of capitalism in the United States in this new century. We had the dot-com crisis in 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now the COVID-19 crisis in 2020. 20 years of a new century, 3 crises, works out to a little less than every 7 years, just in time, just on schedule. We knew we faced a crisis. And since the last one was in 2008, we knew by 2019, by 2018, and by 2017, we were due for the next one. We knew, like we knew the virus could always come. But we weren't prepared. We weren't prepared. And what do I mean by not prepared? I mean the Republicans didn't have us prepared, and the Democrats didn't either. Hospitals have been closing in the United States in recent decades. Closing. Why? Because it wasn't profitable to keep them open. Oh goodness, you're allowing the capitalist notion of profit to be so understood by the monopolizing 2 parties that we closed the institution that might have enabled us to be prepared for a virus. We know you need tests. They should be produced, accumulated, stockpiled in warehouses around the country. You know, like masks and ventilators and everything else. But we didn't, did we? The companies didn't do it because it isn't profitable. You know, to make masks and store them in warehouses where you have to watch them and clean them and repair them and replace them for who knows how long before the next virus hits. Too risky, not profitable. We won't do it. Of course, the government could come in and buy all that and store it and preserve it and maintain it. Could do that. That's, after all, what the government does with military equipment. Same issue. But they didn't do it with the medical. They didn't, because the private medical producers didn't want the government in there. That's for them socialist medicine, and they won't have that because they're terribly afraid that the public will, sooner or later, realize what a rip-off, profit-driven business medicine is. So we weren't prepared. The private sector didn't find it profitable, and the control they have over the 2 monopolizing parties was more than enough. That's why we don't have a national health system. That's why we don't have Medicare for all. That's why we don't have single-payer medicine. And that's why we weren't ready for the virus, and why it is hurting us and killing us on a scale virtually no other country has allowed. Wow. The failure is literally cataclysmic. And the dealing with the economic crisis, if anything, it's even worse, other than not being so deadly in the life and death sense. So, of course, what do you need to do today when there are, by rough estimate, 20 to 40 million Americans unemployed? Wow. What are you doing? Answer: nothing. Neither of the two monopolizing parties has been able to think for one sustained hour, let alone for a year, that the way to handle the unemployment in the private sector is to employ people in the public sector. What are we doing giving millions of people money and not asking them to give something back to society? Sure, with social distancing and masks and all the ways of keeping people healthy that we can learn from all the other countries who've done exactly that and who don't have tens of millions of unemployed. And what would our unemployed do? Oh, goodness, we haven't tested most Americans yet. Unemployed people could become an army of testers. We have 1 million fewer people working in the public service in this country than we did a year ago. As I just explained, we need more public services now because of the broken economy, because of COVID-19. But we don't have more public services because we have fired 1 million of our public employees. Take the unemployed and put them to work for the cities and towns, providing the public services we need now more than ever. There is no problem. This country did that in the 1930s, when the government hired roughly 15 million unemployed Americans. And let me explain what the democratic system we have, in quotations, failed to do. Did we have a vote in this country whether we would like to see these people employed by the government or unemployed? That was not put up for vote because the two parties know that what they support would lose. So it isn't put up to democratic vote. The mass of people who are unemployed want a job. The mass of us who are not getting the product of what those unemployed people could do, we would like them to be paid properly for work that we can all enjoy with them. That's a logical, democratic response. But we don't have that. We are denied that. Even though it's part of our history, neither party at this point found it useful, helpful for them to even debate the subject. Wow. Wow. So what do I conclude? We need to break up the monopoly. We need to do what we have done in the economic sphere at least sometimes. We need trust busters. Only the trust that has to be busted is the political trust, the political monopoly. And one of the easiest, best ways to do it is to begin to build a party that we already know has mass support in the United States, so it can be an effective challenger of the political monopoly. And what do I mean? Here comes the thing not dared yet to be spoken. We need a socialist party. We probably need several, because socialists disagree among themselves, as they always have, and as indeed they should. We should have a range of socialist parties. presenting their critiques of capitalism, their alternatives to capitalism. And why am I confident that this is the way to go? Because we've already had the evidence that there's a basis for it. That's what 2 races by Bernie Sanders showed us. That's what the Occupy Wall Street movement, by spreading to 350 cities in a matter of weeks, showed us. That's what the successful races of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other members of the squad, now doubled in size, that's what they're telling us. Socialists in Missouri, in New York, in California, in Minnesota, yeah, the basis for a socialist elected official, obviously there. Millions of people, obviously there. Millions not only willing to vote, but willing to contribute, as the Bernie Sanders campaign so dramatically showed. The money is there, the people are there, and Lord knows the demand in our monopolized politics is there. For a long time, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler kept everybody else out of the automobile market in the United States. And they made fun of the Tesla. Well, they're not making fun anymore. Turns out, if you open it up, if you allow a different perspective on the very idea of what an automobile is and what makes it run and how you power it, yeah, turns out you can do things. And you know, socialism is like that. There are socialist parties, important ones, in virtually every European country. There are, in fact, multiple socialist parties, some with the name, some with other names, across Europe. Civilization hasn't crumbled there. The economic and political systems are, in as many ways, better than ours as we are better than them. They show us it's feasible, it's manageable, and it can generate very good outcomes. Let me give you an example. One of the countries most successful in emerging out of the crisis of 2008 in Europe was a country that chose not to go the route of austerity, as was done so devastatingly in Greece, in Italy, in Britain, and so on. The country I'm talking about is Portugal, an old, well-established country in Europe. Portugal, for the last 5 or 6 years, has been governed by a coalition. They, and unlike the United States, have multiple parties, not just 2. They don't seem to want a monopoly of 2. They seem to want real freedom of political choice. Governments there tend to be coalitions because no one party runs the society. You know, the way it works here. No, multiple parties have to get together. So they've been governed by a coalition these last years, a coalition that refused to impose an austerity, that instead spent money. The Portuguese are famous. Even before these crises hit, they handled their drug problem in a completely different way from that in the United States. Much more successful. Anyway, the coalition is a coalition of 3 parties. The Portuguese Socialist Party, plus the Portuguese Communist Party, plus the Portuguese Green Party. That's right. A coalition of various kinds of socialists. And they're doing fine. And they are a model for others. There's no reason we don't have that here. And I want to close my list of guests to present to you by offering 2 people who, in different ways, are moving in the direction I'm talking about, wanting to see change, activating it, educating it, mobilizing it. The failures we are living through in our public health, in our economics, are more than enough, but it's not a complete list, to justify change. So let me introduce a colleague of mine, an economist, a young woman who has been spearheading the intersection of economic change, racial change, and the centrality of cooperative enterprises dealing with those problems that are so deep in the United States. So I would like to introduce you, if you do not already know her work, Jessica Gordon-Nembhard.
My name is Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. I'm a Black political economist and specialist in community economic development and cooperative and solidarity economics. I actually have very mixed feelings about this election. I'm heartened that so many people voted, especially in the middle of a COVID pandemic. I'm disgusted by the long lines they had to wait in and the continued suppression and intimidation of Black and brown and incarcerated voters. I'm surprised and frustrated that so many people voted to keep the current administration, which I thought had proven itself to be dysfunctional, tyrannical, racist, and misogynistic. I continue to be against private financing of political campaigns. I'm horrified at the billions of private dollars that were spent on the campaigns. I believe more than ever that we need all political campaigns to be only and equally publicly financed. And I think we have to eliminate the Electoral College. No way around that. We, the people, are not really in control of our elections. I'm also disheartened that the Democratic Party bargained that it had to stay centrist in order to win, but of course I'm excited that we have the first Black woman vice president. Given all that, I'm hopeful that these next few years will be ones where we can truly and honestly discuss the need for genuine economic transformation and move toward the solidarity, economic, cooperative commonwealth that I have written and talked about for over 10 years. If nothing else, this past year has clearly pointed out that our current economic and political systems are not working. We need universal health insurance and health care. We need a real public health system. We need transparency and accurate information from our government. We need true democratic practices. We need community and cooperative ownership and to democratize capital. We can't achieve racial justice or racial and gender equity without economic democracy and economic justice, but we also can't achieve economic democracy without racial and gender equity. So we have to work intersectionally and on multiple fronts. I'm convinced that we can achieve this in part by starting to or continuing to practice economic democracy in our everyday lives and demand it throughout our society. We should commit to an extensive nationwide campaign for cooperative and solidarity economics education. We should demand that public money be dedicated to support cooperative business development, especially worker cooperatives. Co-ops, especially worker cooperatives, address community needs. They generate income, they create wealth, they redistribute capital through democratic participation in production and distribution. In addition, there are spillover effects from economic cooperation, such as leadership development, collective decision-making, conflict resolution and transformation, profit sharing. And so we need to think about how co-ops, how we can make this a reality for more of us. So I just want to make my plug. Co-ops provide access to quality goods and services. They save costs, they increase income, they fairly distribute wealth. They anchor resources, recirculate them in a community. They save or create decent jobs. They develop economic agency and collective action. They develop leadership, as I said. And they develop economic democracy. What do I mean by that? Economic decisions and activities that are people-centered, not centered on profit maximization. create grassroots economic frameworks based on solidarity, cooperation, and human dignity. We reduce hierarchy and dominance in economic relations and decision-making. Economic democracy also allows multiple voices and multiple stakeholders to participate together. Workers and invisible laborers have the largest voice in what they make, what it costs, how they work together, what they get paid, what happens to the surplus. In worker cooperatives, workers have the voice in decision making. And finally, I want to add that the research I've done on Black co-ops finds that co-ops help to combat racial discrimination, to enable Black community ownership and decision making, leading to Black self-determination. Co-ops, mutual aid, economic solidarity enable access to and control over culturally and geographically sensitive and appropriate goods and services. Co-ops and collective ownership increase Black economic stability, self-sufficiency, and group independence, and increase community wealth and prosperity for Blacks. These benefits are similar across all groups and for all humanity. As usual, none of this will happen or be achieved if we are not vocal and active with our demands, both starting to practice and design the world we want to live in, while demanding that our government enact policies and allocate money to support this vision. Now's the time.
Thank you, Jessica. For my last guest commentator, I want to introduce you to Lee Carter. He is an elected member of the Virginia House of Delegates, the legislature in the state of Virginia. He is an ex-Marine, and he is a socialist. He knows what he speaks about. He's a critic of capitalism. He ran some years ago, and he was recently reelected. That's right. He embodies what is possible already now under all of the adverse conditions of a monopolized political system. He is the exception. He is breaking the mold. He is emerging. Like others, he shows that it's possible. He shows what is possible. And his voice, therefore, is particularly important in reacting to the election process of which he is now an integral part. People like him, inside the Democratic Party, where some are, outside, where more are, those two parts of an emerging socialist movement and of an eventual socialist party or parties are very important voices to listen to. So with pleasure, I introduce you to Lee Carter.
Hi, I'm Lee Carter. I'm a member of the Virginia House of Delegates and the only elected socialist in any Southern legislature. I'm here today to talk about the consequences of the 2020 election. Now, this election is one unlike any other that we've lived through. It's the first time, to my knowledge, the United States has had a presidential election during a global pandemic. We've had pandemics before, and we've had consequential elections before, but never at once. Now, those consequences of the election are a bit more subtle than you might be actually hearing about. A lot of people are talking about how this election is the most important election of all time, how this election has saved democracy. But the differences between the outgoing president, President Trump, and the incoming president, President-elect Biden, are really a lot more subtle than most people make them out to be. Now, Donald Trump certainly was a president unlike previous presidents in that he displayed the cruelty that he was exhibiting with the powers of his office really at the forefront of what he did. He bragged about the cruelty behind his policies. But those policies truly were a difference in degree more so than a difference in kind over his predecessors. When you look at policies like family separation at the border, yes, Donald Trump had a much more cruel policy of family separation at the border, but it was a difference of how people were separated rather than whether or not people were separated. His predecessor, President Obama, and his predecessor, President Bush, both had exceedingly cruel policies of deportation for people at the border. His policies on the economy were a difference in degree, not a difference in kind from his predecessors. President Trump used his powers as president to more directly intervene on behalf of big business giants, but that's something that we've seen before. President Obama directed tens, hundreds of billions of dollars in bailouts to the large corporate giants, and President Bush did before him. The policies that actually impact people on the day-to-day were differences in degree rather than differences in kind with President Trump versus his predecessors. Healthcare policy, people still have to pay exorbitant premiums that rise every year, exorbitant deductibles that rise every year, and still receive the lowest quality of care of any country in the industrialized world. Because again, these policies towards healthcare, towards the economy, towards immigration, towards foreign policy, these were all differences in degree rather than differences in kind. So this election has really been one of the system putting the mask back on. The president that's leaving office is one who displayed his cruelty. He bragged about it. He was proud of it. But the president that's coming in will have policies that will still have victims. And we still have to organize to end those policies. We still have to organize to create the kind of world where people have the freedom of motion, to create a better life for themselves. If they're escaping a war-torn country or a poor economy where they're coming from, they have to be able to come here and actually create a better life for themselves and their families. We have to create the kind of world where people don't have to choose between bankruptcy and going to a doctor. We have to we have to build the kind of world where people are actually in control of the economy rather than being controlled by it. And that's something that's not going to be done in a single election. That's something that needs to be done through constant effort, through struggle, through organization, through people taking the initiative and building a cooperative economy. One where working people own and operate the enterprise where they work on a democratic basis, a one-person, one-vote basis, because that is the base of power in our society. When we have actually built an economy that works for us because it's being worked by us, that is when we will be able to actually change these policies in kind rather than in degree. That is when we will be able to choose between a president that really serves us and one that serves the corporate interests rather than just two different versions of corporate presidencies. That is the consequence of the 2020 election.
Thank you, Lee. I would like to conclude by asking all of you, not only to thank our guests, as I do, for adding their commentaries to this important chapter in American history, and indeed in the history of the world, because the United States remains an important player in this world, even though that importance is declining. And indeed, the notion of American decline and the decline of the United States is perhaps another theme that underlay this election, and that, like the need for a socialist party, can't quite be spoken yet. But the decline is there if you're willing to see it. And the starkest example is the People's Republic of China. I'm not here to analyze to what degree their self-naming as socialist is or isn't reasonable. Socialism, as I keep telling everyone, has always been debated as to what exactly it means, what its boundaries separating it from capitalism actually are. And that's a good debate to keep going. I'm in favor of that debate. I have a position on that debate, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Chinese technology now rivals that of the United States. Chinese production now rivals that of the United States. In the last few days, China was one of 15 countries that created the largest free trade zone in the world. 30% of the world's product is now going to be traded over the next few years without tariffs, or at least with sharply reduced tariffs, in a movement towards multilateral, open-ended trade, the exact opposite direction that Mr. Trump was taking this country, and which the Democratic Party and its establishment allowed him to do. The Chinese are everywhere in the ascendant. They're a rising power. 2 weeks ago, they sent up rockets with new 6G technology, where the United States is still trying to catch up to China on 5G. And there are many, many more examples. It is dangerous and difficult for countries to go through their decline. One of the major ways of dealing with it is denial. And that is extremely popular in the United States. So we have competitive bashing of China, denouncing them for issues real and imagined, instead of trying to figure out a way not to have economic rivalry become military engagement between two nuclear powers. The two-party monopoly hasn't figured out how to deal with this society, how to deal with its own decline, let alone with the ascendancy of the People's Republic of China. It's another in the long list of things this political monopoly could not and is not handling effectively, let alone democratically. So yes, we need fundamental change. And a message of all my guests is the one I want to close with. More than anything else, we don't need now to tell ourselves there isn't a basis for a socialist change. We know there is. We've gone out collectively and done the work to find them, to name them, to mobilize them, and to get elected by them. And we know people around the world are struggling in the same direction. That's why it was important for Yanis Varoufakis, a leader of that effort in Europe, to join with us as a representative of all the others. We are not small and we are not alone. And what we're doing has a better claim for saving democracy and installing it in our world than the loudmouth champions who refer to a system that never was democratic and to themselves as the saviors of the system that never was. We can do better than that politics, and the reason is that we can do better than capitalism. If our work and these every other month presentations have been useful for you, please let me ask you to support what we do, however much you can. And the best possible way is to go to Patreon, 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 and join with our initials, GCLEU, Global Capitalism Live Economic Update. Patreon/GCLEU will get you to our Patreon page where you can support us, or by going to our website where a one-time donation is equally possible. Thank you for joining us, and let me remind you that we will be back here at our normal second Wednesday of the evening next time, January 13th, 7:30 p.m., in the year 2021. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work. Good night.